A woman's discovery reveals a secret her family kept buried for decades. Mia thought she knew everything about her family. But when she stumbles upon an old box hidden deep in her grandmother's attic, she unearths a secret that had been buried for generations, one that will change everything she believed about her past. What was hidden away for so long, and why had no one ever spoken of it? Before we begin, tell us in the comments, if you discovered an old family secret, would you want to know the truth, or leave it buried? And if you love mysterious and emotional stories, don't forget to like this video to support the channel. Now, sit back, relax, and enjoy the story. Mia sat on the dusty floor of the attic, her legs crossed beneath her as she wiped cobwebs off her sleeves. It was late afternoon, and sunlight filtered through the small window, casting streaks of golden light across the forgotten room. Her grandmother's house had always been full of memories, but this attic felt like another world entirely. It was quiet here, almost too quiet, and the air carried a faint, nostalgic scent of lavender and cedarwood. She'd been at this all morning, packing up her grandmother's belongings. The living room was already filled with neatly labeled boxes, each one containing fragments of a life well lived. Photo albums, knitted scarves, porcelain figurines. But the attic was different. It was untouched, like a hidden vault waiting to be opened. Mia's gaze fell on a chest in the far corner of the room. It was old, its leather straps cracked and faded with time, and something about it pulled her in. She felt a strange twinge of curiosity as she made her way across the creaking wooden floor. When she knelt before the chest and opened it, the scent of lavender grew stronger. For a moment, Mia froze, her breath catching. That smell, it was her grandmother's. She closed her eyes and let it wash over her, imagining her grandmother standing in the doorway, calling her inside for tea. Inside the chest, everything was meticulously arranged. There were embroidered handkerchiefs, old black and white photographs, and a stack of letters tied with a faded ribbon. At the very bottom, Mia spotted something wrapped in tissue paper. She pulled it out carefully and unfolded it in her lap. It was a quilt, or at least the beginnings of one. The unfinished quilt was beautiful, even in its incomplete state. Each square was unique, stitched with vibrant colors and intricate patterns. One square depicted a sunflower, its golden petals radiating warmth. Another showed a barn nestled among rolling green hills. A third portrayed a river winding gracefully between two tall oak trees. Mia ran her fingers over the fabric, tracing the delicate stitches. Something about the quilt felt familiar, though she couldn't place why. Beneath it, she noticed a small, weathered notebook. She picked it up and flipped it open, revealing her grandmother's handwriting. The first few pages were filled with notes about the quilt. Her grandmother had written about each square, as though documenting their significance. Mia read aloud softly, her voice trembling. The sunflower square reminds me of the year of the drought, 1965. Mama's garden never gave up, even when the rain did. The barn square is Grandpa's sanctuary during the war years, a place where hope and dreams flourished, even in darkness. The river square is for summers with Ruth, with the tire swing and the sound of laughter echoing in the woods. Mia stopped, her heart tightening. Ruth, that name felt familiar too. Her grandmother had mentioned Ruth once or twice, but never in detail. Flipping further into the notebook, Mia found more scattered notes, written with the same careful hand. The quilt square for Mia is still unfinished. Ruth's memory is always stitched in my heart. This quilt is for her, for Mia, when she's ready. The mention of her own name sent a chill through Mia. She stared at the words, her grandmother's voice echoing in her mind. This quilt had been meant for her. Looking down at the fabric spread across her lap, Mia realized it wasn't just a quilt. It was a story. Each square was a chapter, a piece of her grandmother's life stitched together with love and care. But the quilt wasn't complete. The last square was only a rough outline, the threads dangling where her grandmother's hands had stopped. A wave of emotion swept over Mia. Her grandmother had been her biggest supporter, always encouraging her dreams. When Mia decided to move to the city to become a textile artist, it was her grandmother who sent her packages of fabric, handwritten letters, and even cookies to keep her spirits up. But life had gotten in the way. Mia's visits had become infrequent. Her phone calls rushed. She had always told herself there would be time to catch up later. And now, later had run out. That evening, Mia brought the quilt and the notebook back to her small apartment in the city. Her studio space was cluttered with unfinished projects, half-sewn dresses, piles of fabric scraps, and sketches pinned to the walls. But she cleared her work table, pushing everything aside to make room for the quilt. Under the warm glow of her desk lamp, she studied it again. Each square was more intricate than anything she had ever made. The sunflower, the barn, the river, they weren't just patterns, they were memories. Her grandmother's memories. But the unfinished square seemed to call out to her the most. It was empty, waiting to be filled. Mia opened the notebook again, searching for clues about how to complete it. The final pages held only rough sketches and a few words. She'll know what to do when the time comes. Mia's throat tightened. Her grandmother had trusted her to finish this. But how could she? The quilt was more than a collection of fabric. It was a legacy. What if she ruined it? What if her stitches weren't good enough? She spent hours sitting at her work table, staring at the quilt and the notebook. The city outside her window buzzed with life. Cars honking, people shouting. But Mia hardly noticed. All she could think about was her grandmother. Memories began to surface, unbidden. She saw herself as a little girl, sitting beside her grandmother on the porch swing. She remembered the warmth of her grandmother's hands guiding hers as they stitched together for the first time. She could almost hear her grandmother's laugh, rich and full of life. Finally, Mia picked up her needle and thread. Her hands trembled as she made the first stitch. It wasn't perfect. Her fingers were rusty after months of creative block. But it was a start. As the hours passed, the world outside faded away. The hum of traffic became distant, replaced by the steady rhythm of her needle moving through the fabric. She didn't finish the square that night, but as the first light of dawn crept through her window, she felt a sense of peace she hadn't felt in years. "This is just the beginning," she whispered to herself. The quilt wasn't just a project. It was a bridge, a way to reconnect with the woman who had shaped her life. And in finishing it, Mia realized she might find a way to stitch her own fragmented story back together. The quilt now sat in the center of Mia's studio, its presence impossible to ignore. It was more than fabric and thread. It was her grandmother's voice, her guiding hand, her love woven into every stitch. But finishing it felt like a monumental task. Mia sat at her work table, staring at the unfinished square. It loomed over her, both inspiring and intimidating. The rest of the quilt told stories she had barely begun to understand. Each square represented a moment in her grandmother's life, but Mia's knowledge of those moments was patchy at best. She couldn't complete the quilt until she understood its meaning, and that meant uncovering the memories her grandmother had kept so carefully hidden. She opened the notebook again, this time flipping back to the earlier entries. Her grandmother's handwriting, neat and deliberate, filled the pages. Each note was a breadcrumb leading to a story. Spring, 1965. The sunflower field stretched as far as the eye could see. That was the year of the drought, when hope seemed impossible to find. But the sunflowers kept blooming, their faces turned toward the light, as if they knew the rain would come. Mia could almost see it. Her grandmother standing in that field, the sun beating down, the air dry and brittle. She imagined her grandmother's hands brushing against the flowers, drawing strength from their resilience. Mia smiled to herself. That resilience had been a hallmark of her grandmother's character. It was something she had always admired, even if she hadn't fully appreciated it at the time. Turning the page, Mia found another entry. Summer, 1973. The barn was a place of refuge, a sanctuary when the world outside felt too heavy. Grandpa built it with his own hands, each beam a testament to his patience and determination. It wasn't just a barn, it was a dream, a promise that life could be rebuilt, no matter how broken it seemed. The words stirred something deep within Mia. She thought of the countless stories her grandmother had told about her grandfather, a man Mia had never met but felt she knew intimately through her grandmother's vivid recollections. She leaned back in her chair, staring at the unfinished square. The quilt wasn't just a map of her grandmother's life. It was a way of showing Mia how to navigate her own. But one name kept resurfacing in the notebook, a thread that tied everything together: Ruth. Ruth's name appeared in almost every entry, often accompanied by words like laughter, adventure, and loss. Yet Mia knew so little about her. Her grandmother had spoken of Ruth occasionally, always with a mix of fondness and sadness, but the details were vague. Mia flipped to the last page of the notebook, where Ruth's name was scrawled one final time. Beneath it was a single sentence: "To find Ruth is to find the missing piece." Mia's heart raced. Who was Ruth, and what had happened to her? The question consumed her. She spent hours poring over the photographs from the attic, searching for clues. Many of the pictures were familiar: her grandmother as a young woman, her grandfather standing proudly by the barn, family gatherings filled with smiling faces. But one photo stood out. It was a black and white snapshot of two young girls, no older than 10 or 11. They sat side by side on a tree swing, their feet dangling just above the ground. One of them was unmistakably her grandmother, her hair tied in two neat braids. The other girl, with a wide grin and a playful glint in her eyes, could only be Ruth. On the back of the photo, written in her grandmother's handwriting, was a date: August 1946. Beneath it were the words, "The summer everything changed." Mia stared at the photograph, her mind spinning. Her grandmother had kept this photo for decades, hidden away in the attic. What had happened that summer? Why was Ruth such an important part of her grandmother's life? Driven by a need to understand, Mia decided to visit her mother. If anyone could shed light on Ruth's story, it would be her. The next day, Mia drove to her mother's house, the photograph and notebook tucked safely in her bag. The air was crisp, the autumn leaves swirling in the wind as she made her way up the familiar front steps. Her mother greeted her with a surprised smile. "Mia, this is a nice surprise. What brings you here?" "I found something in Grandma's attic," Mia said, holding up the notebook and photograph. "I think it's important. Can we talk?" Her mother's smile faded slightly, replaced by a look of curiosity and concern. She led Mia into the living room, where they sat side by side on the couch. Mia handed her the photograph. "Do you know who Ruth is?" Her mother's expression softened as she looked at the picture. "Ruth was your grandmother's best friend. They were inseparable growing up." "What happened to her?" Mia asked. Her mother hesitated, her fingers tracing the edge of the photograph. "I don't know all the details. Grandma didn't talk about Ruth much, but I know they had a falling out. Something happened that summer, something that changed everything. After that, Ruth left town, and they never saw each other again." Mia's heart sank. Did Grandma ever try to find her? "I think she did," her mother said. "But back then, it wasn't as easy as it is now. No internet, no social media. Once someone was gone, they were really gone." Mia looked down at the photograph, her mind racing. "I need to know more. I think Ruth is the key to finishing the quilt." Her mother gave her a thoughtful look. "If anyone can uncover the story, it's you. Your grandmother always said you had her determination." Mia smiled faintly, the weight of her task settling on her shoulders. She didn't know where this journey would lead, but she was determined to follow it to the end. That evening, back in her studio, Mia spread the quilt across her work table once more. The unfinished square seemed to pulse with meaning, its blankness both a challenge and an invitation. She picked up her needle and thread, her hands steady as she began to stitch. The quilt wasn't just her grandmother's story anymore. It was hers too. And as the first threads of the new square took shape, Mia felt a flicker of hope. Somewhere out there, Ruth's story was waiting to be found. Mia spent the next few days immersed in research, her studio slowly transforming into a command center. The photograph of her grandmother and Ruth was pinned to the wall, surrounded by notes, sketches, and old clippings from the attic. The quilt remained on the work table, its unfinished square reminding her of the questions she still needed to answer. Her first step was to trace Ruth's history. The notebook offered clues. Mentions of a local church where her grandmother and Ruth had spent their Sunday afternoons, a diner they frequented after school, and the library where they had checked out countless books. Mia decided to visit these places, hoping to find someone who might remember Ruth or have information that could lead her to her story. The church was her first stop. Its white steeple rose against the bright blue sky, a beacon of constancy in a town that had changed little over the years. Inside, the wooden pews gleamed with polish, and sunlight filtered through stained glass windows, casting colorful patterns on the floor. An older woman was arranging flowers near the altar, her hands moving with practiced ease. "Excuse me," Mia said, her voice hesitant. "I'm looking for someone who might remember my grandmother, Eleanor, and her friend Ruth. They used to come here in the 1940s. The woman turned, her eyes bright with curiosity. "Eleanor? Oh, I remember her well. She had the sweetest singing voice, always leading the choir. Ruth, too, was a regular here. They were inseparable." Mia's heart quickened. "Do you know what happened to Ruth?" "They lost touch, and I'm trying to piece together the story." The woman's face softened with a mix of fondness and regret. "Ruth left town suddenly. I don't know why, but there were whispers. Some said her family had financial troubles. Others thought there was a disagreement between the girls. Whatever the reason, it was as if she vanished overnight." Mia nodded, her mind racing with possibilities. "Thank you. That helps more than you know." As she left the church, Mia couldn't shake the feeling that the answers she sought were closer than they seemed. The diner was her next stop, a place that had changed little since her grandmother's time. Its red vinyl booths and checkerboard floors exuded a timeless charm. The owner, a man in his 70s, greeted her warmly. "Eleanor's granddaughter?" he asked when Mia introduced herself. "I remember your grandmother well. She and Ruth used to sit in that corner booth, laughing like they didn't have a care in the world." "Do you know why Ruth left?" Mia asked, leaning forward eagerly. The man shook his head. "I was just a kid back then, but I remember seeing Eleanor come in alone after Ruth left. She seemed lost, like she'd lost a piece of herself." Mia thanked him and made her way to the library, her final stop for the day. The librarian, an older woman with glasses perched on her nose, listened intently as Mia explained her quest. "Eleanor and Ruth were regulars here," the librarian said, leading Mia to a dusty archive room. "If they left any trace, it might be in the old records." Mia spent hours combing through yearbooks, newspapers, and library cards. Her patience was rewarded when she found a newspaper clipping from 1946. It featured a photograph of a group of young girls standing in front of the town's community center. Ruth was among them, her smile as vibrant as it was in the photo Mia had found in the attic. The article accompanying the photograph was about a summer dance held at the community center. It mentioned Ruth by name, describing her as the life of the party. But there was no mention of her departure or the reason behind it. Frustrated but determined, Mia photocopied the article and left the library as the sun dipped below the horizon. Back in her studio that evening, Mia spread her findings across the table. Each piece of the puzzle added texture to Ruth's story, but the picture was still incomplete. She stared at the quilt, her fingers tracing the edges of the unfinished square. Her phone buzzed, pulling her from her thoughts. It was her mother. "Any luck with your search?" her mother asked. "A little," Mia said, explaining what she had found. "But I still don't know why Ruth left or what it meant to Grandma." There was a pause on the other end of the line before her mother spoke again, her voice thoughtful. "You know, your great-aunt Mabel might remember something. She was older than your grandmother and more aware of what was going on back then. She lives in Fairview now, at the assisted living center." Mia felt a spark of hope. "I'll visit her tomorrow. Thank you, Mom." The next morning, Mia drove to Fairview, the town a short distance from her own. The assisted living center was warm and inviting, its walls adorned with cheerful paintings and photographs. She found Mabel in the common room, a spry woman with sharp eyes that belied her age. "Mabel," Mia said after introducing herself, "I'm trying to learn more about Grandma and Ruth. Do you remember what happened between them?" Mabel's eyes narrowed slightly, as if she were sifting through decades of memories. "Oh, Ruth, yes, I remember her. She and Eleanor were thick as thieves, but something happened that summer. They argued. About what, I can't say for sure. Ruth's family moved away not long after. It was sudden, almost like they were running from something." Mia leaned forward. "Do you think Grandma ever forgave her? Mabel's expression softened. Your grandmother never stopped missing Ruth. She kept that photograph of them on the swing until the day she passed. I think she forgave her, but she always wondered if Ruth forgave her too. Mia's throat tightened. The quilt wasn't just about her grandmother's life. It was also about the love, loss, and forgiveness that defined it. She left Fairview with a renewed sense of purpose, determined to find the missing threads of Ruth's story. That evening, back in her studio, Mia began stitching again. The unfinished square slowly took shape, her needle guided by the stories she had uncovered. It wasn't just her grandmother's legacy she was preserving. It was Ruth's too. And as the threads intertwined, Mia felt a connection to both women, as if they were whispering their truths through her hands. The journey wasn't over, but Mia was closer than ever to understanding the quilt's meaning. And as the fabric beneath her fingers came alive with color and pattern, she knew she was creating something far more than a piece of art. She was creating a bridge, a way to bring the past into the present and carry it forward into the future. In the weeks that followed, Mia immersed herself in the quilt, her hands working tirelessly as she pieced together the final square. The studio had become a sanctuary, the hum of her sewing machine a comforting rhythm in the background. Yet Ruth's story remained elusive. The fragments Mia had gathered hinted at a life interrupted, a friendship torn apart, but the deeper truth still lingered just out of reach. It was during one quiet evening as Mia reviewed her notes that a sudden thought struck her. The photograph she had found in the attic, the one of Ruth and Eleanor on the swing, had something she hadn't fully considered. In the background of the picture was a house, its porch adorned with climbing roses. The details were faint, but distinctive enough to stand out. Mia retrieved the photograph, holding it up to the light. Could this house still exist? It was a long shot, but if she could find it, perhaps she could uncover the final piece of the puzzle. The next morning, Mia set out with a determination she hadn't felt in weeks. Armed with the photograph and her laptop, she began searching through Old Town records and maps. It wasn't long before she found what she was looking for. The house in the photograph belonged to Ruth's family and, according to the records, was located in a small town several miles away. Excitement surged through her as she made the drive. The town was quiet, its streets lined with old oak trees and vintage storefronts. Following the directions she had pieced together, Mia soon found herself standing in front of a weathered but beautiful home. The climbing roses were long gone, but the house was unmistakable. She hesitated before walking up the steps and knocking on the door. After a few moments, an elderly woman answered, her eyes sharp and curious. "Can I help you?" the woman asked. Mia took a deep breath, holding up the photograph. "I'm looking for information about Ruth. She was a close friend of my grandmother, Eleanor. I believe she used to live here." The woman's expression softened as she examined the photograph. "You're Eleanor's granddaughter? Well, I'm Ruth's niece. My name is Margaret." Mia's heart leapt. "Do you know what happened to her?" "My grandmother kept this photo all her life, and I think she always wondered what became of Ruth." Margaret gestured for Mia to come inside, her voice tinged with nostalgia. "I can tell you some of it. Aunt Ruth didn't talk much about the past, but I know she and Eleanor had a falling out. Ruth's father got into some trouble, debts he couldn't pay, and the family had to leave town in a hurry. Ruth never got to say goodbye. It broke her heart." Mia sat down in the cozy living room, the weight of Margaret's words sinking in. "Did she ever try to reconnect?" "She did," Margaret said, her tone wistful. "Years later, when things settled down. But by then, Eleanor had moved, and Ruth didn't know where to find her. She always regretted losing touch." Mia's chest tightened. The years of separation, the unanswered questions, they were wounds carried by both women. "Where is Ruth now?" Margaret's smile was gentle, but tinged with sadness. "She passed away about 10 years ago. But she always spoke fondly of Eleanor. She kept a box of letters and photographs from their time together. I think she wanted someone to have them someday." Margaret disappeared into another room and returned with a small, weathered box. She placed it in Mia's hands with a solemn expression. "Maybe this will help you find the answers you're looking for." Mia opened the box carefully, her eyes scanning the contents. Inside were letters, postcards, and small trinkets from Ruth's life. One letter caught her attention. It was addressed to Eleanor but never sent. The date on the envelope matched the summer Ruth had left town. Mia unfolded the letter, her hands trembling. The words were heartfelt, filled with apologies and love. Ruth had written of her family's struggles, her sorrow at leaving without a proper goodbye, and her hope that one day they might meet again. Tears blurred Mia's vision as she read the final lines. "You were my truest friend, Eleanor. I hope this isn't goodbye forever. I'll carry you with me always." Mia thanked Margaret profusely, her heart heavy but full of gratitude. Back in her studio that evening, she placed Ruth's letter alongside the quilt. The final square was nearly complete, its patterns and colors a tapestry of lives intertwined. As Mia stitched the last thread, she felt a profound sense of closure, not just for her grandmother and Ruth, but for herself as well. The quilt was more than a piece of art now. It was a story, a testament to friendship, resilience, and the power of connection. And as Mia stepped back to admire her work, she knew it was ready to be shared. A week later, Mia unveiled the quilt at a local gallery, inviting friends, family, and members of the community. Among the attendees was Margaret, who stood quietly in the corner, her eyes misty as she gazed at the finished piece. Mia addressed the crowd, her voice steady but emotional. "This quilt is more than fabric and thread. It's a journey, a story about two women who loved deeply and lost each other, but whose bond endured across time. It's a reminder that even when we lose someone, their light stays with us." The applause that followed was thunderous, but what mattered most to Mia was the quiet moment she shared with Margaret after the event. Together, they stood before the quilt, tracing the patterns with their eyes, their hearts connected by the memories it held. Later that night, as Mia returned to her studio, she felt an overwhelming sense of peace. The quilt, now complete, was more than a tribute to the past. It was a bridge to the present, a way to honor the love and legacy of two women who had shaped her life in ways she was only beginning to understand. And as she turned off the lights and closed the studio door, Mia knew she was carrying their story forward, stitching it into her own with every step she took. If you like this story, be sure to give it a thumbs up. It really helps the channel grow. And if you enjoy stories that embraces your heart, don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss a new upload. I'd love to hear your thoughts on this one. Let me know in the comments what stood out to you the most. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next story.